that her background in the military, in the civil and criminal litigation, in areas of research related to the Constitution. Now I know you've got some questions. I know you do right off. And she will recognize you. If they can't go any farther and they're jumping up and down in their seats, you know what that means. They got to have an answer. But give her a chance to get started in here. Publius Huldah, right? Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Can everyone hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Tonight I'm going to talk about the original intent of the Constitution, and I am going to prove to you that our Constitution is a theological document. We are losing our country, but we are not losing it because of dark conspiracies, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateralists, and the CFR. We are losing our country because we abandoned the faith of our fathers, our founding principles, and reason, the ability to analyze and think things through. The English Puritans who came here in the 1630s understood that the Old Testament has a great deal to say about civil government, and they came to build that shining city on a hill. They did not come here to wait for the end of the world, to escape from the world, or to surrender it to evil. And so we became a shining city on a hill, and then we created a constitution which is based on God's model for civil government. That is what I am going to show you tonight. But we abandoned that faith and those principles. Not only did we abandon the biblical principles on which our Declaration and Constitution are based, we lost the understanding that principles are important. The idea that we should conform our own precious opinions to principles that come from outside ourselves is preposterous to many Americans today. There's a feedback. Did you all hear a feedback, a popping sound? What should I do? I'm holding this too close and not far enough.
You're okay. We hear you okay here. We're fine.
Okay. All right. So does it sound okay? Oh, okay. All right. Go to any website where people post comments. Read the comments. People don't talk about principles. They just spout off their own subjective opinions. Because we lost the ability to analyze, to think, we no longer look under the surface. We too often believe whatever we hear. False statements about the Constitution are made all the time on Fox News, on the radio, and we see them regurgitated on the internet. This is part of the misinformation dissemination which is pulling us down into the abyss. But we can change our ways. There is still time. There is a way to restore our greatness. Our clergy have been out to lunch for a very long time. We need our pastors to renounce escapism and defeat, declare their independence from the federal government, throw off the chains of the 501c3 tax exemption, and start being the salt and light they are called to be, the watchman on the wall, the black regiment of our revolution. We can learn our founding principles. We can replace our personal opinions with eternal principles which are true. We must stop spreading misinformation. We mustn't repeat what we hear unless we fully understand it and know that it is true. We must think things through before we advocate for them. a proposed fix like these terrible proposed amendments to the Constitution, they may sound good on the surface, but we need to look under the nice-sounding name. It's usually a trick. The material about the biblical foundation of the Constitution will be posted online soon. The other material is already online throughout the internet and on my website. You all have an outline which lists the points that I'll cover tonight. The first 2 points will take the most time. We will move more quickly through the rest. And after my presentation, which will take about an hour and 15 minutes, I'll take questions about the Constitution. The biblical foundation of our federal government. You have seen the references to God in our Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution itself. The laws of nature and of nature's God, endowed by their Creator with rights, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, with a firm reliance on divine providence. And in our Constitution, at the very last clause of Article 7, in the year of our Lord, 1787. God has a model for civil government, and it is all laid out in the Old Testament. Our framers knew this, and so they based our Declaration and Constitution on God's model for civil government. That is why our country was so much better than what the rest of the world was built. For the most part, we followed God's model. Other countries didn't. The blessing which flows from God's model is liberty. That is why our Liberty Bell quotes Leviticus 25:10. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Tonight, I'll show you 12 biblical principles of civil government on which our framers built our Constitution. First, I'll show you 6 principles which come right out of the Bible and how our framers applied them. Then I'll show you 6 principles Thomas Jefferson listed in the Declaration of Independence and show how those principles are also incorporated into our Constitution. Next slide. Doug, next slide. Yeah. Here are the first 6 principles. These are on your outline. They're very important. The civil authorities are subject to the law. The law comes from a higher source than the civil authorities. This was a radical concept for the world. Civil government has only limited and defined powers. Civil government is divided into 3 parts. The civil authorities promise to obey the higher law. When the civil authorities violate the higher law, the people must rebuke them. The people's obligation to obey the civil authorities is conditional upon the civil authorities obeying the higher law. The people will suffer if they go along with the civil authorities who violate the higher law. Now I'll show you where you can find these principles in the Bible and how our framers applied them. The list of scripture is not complete. I just listed a few tonight to show you that this really does come out of the Bible. When it's posted online, I'll have a longer list of scripture. 1, the civil authorities are under the law. The Bible says that God is the lawmaker. The kings are to apply God's law. For example, in Deuteronomy 17:18 through 20, says that the king is to write out a copy of God's law. He is to have it by him and read from it all his life, so that he may keep, observe, and apply it. 1 Kings 2:1 through 4 tells of King David on his deathbed. He called his son Solomon and told him that he must conform to God's law, observe his statutes, commandments, and just judgments as written in the law of Moses. The parallel in our Constitution is this. The Constitution is the supreme law which people in the federal government are to obey. Noah Webster's 1828 American Dictionary defines Constitution, and I quote, "In free states, the Constitution is paramount to the statutes or laws enacted by the legislature, limiting and controlling its power. And in the United States, the legislature is created and its powers designated by the Constitution." So our Constitution is the standard by which the validity of all acts of Congress, all acts of the executive branch, all judicial opinions, and all treaties is measured and judged. This is in the Supremacy Clause of Article 6, Section 2. So this is what the rule of law means. When the civil authorities obey the higher law, be it God's law or our Constitution. Tyrants claim that they are the source of law. The Roman Caesars, Stalin, Hitler, the dictator of North Korea, and Obama all claim that their will is law. Consider Obama's usurpacious executive orders and the rules made by his executive agencies. This is what the rule of man means. When the civil authorities deny that they are subject to our higher law, be it God's law or the Constitution, and hold that their will is law. 2. Civil government has only limited and defined powers. The Bible. When you read through the Old Testament, you see that civil government is limited to military matters, enforcement of only a few of God's laws, the laws to which a penalty for violation is attached, such as the laws against murder, theft, kidnapping, and judges are available to decide disputes between the people. Most of the other laws of God are a matter of individual and family self-government. For example, charity, education, family welfare, don't drink too much, work hard, and be prudent. The parallel in our Constitution is that it is one of enumerated powers. Only a few powers are delegated to the federal government. Article 1, Section 8 lists most of them. Altogether, we delegated about 21 powers only to the federal government. All other powers are retained by the states or the people. Self-government means that as individuals, we govern ourselves and our families in accordance with the laws of God. It does not mean that we elect representatives to manage our lives for us. Tyrants claim the power to do whatever they want. 3. A civil government is divided into 3 parts. The Bible at Isaiah 33:22 says that the Lord is our judge, lawgiver, and king. Our Constitution has 3 branches: judicial, legislative, and executive. Or rather, our Constitution created a federal government of 3 branches. No one human can be trusted with all 3 of these powers, so our Constitution separates our federal government into 3 branches, with each branch having checks on the powers of the other branches. Tyrants seek to exercise all 3 kinds of power. Obama is making Congress irrelevant. When they refuse to pass a law he wants, he enacts it by executive order or by agency regulation. He's making the judicial branch irrelevant by ignoring their decisions which go against his will. 4. The civil authorities promise to obey the higher law. In the Bible, the king promises to obey God's law and to apply God's law in the kingdom. For example, King Josiah's covenant at 2 Kings 23:1-3. King Josiah called all the people together, and in their presence read aloud to them the book of the law which had been found in the temple. Then King Josiah entered into a covenant with God that he would obey him and keep his commandments and statutes as written in the book of the law. And all the people pledged themselves to this covenant. The parallel in our Constitution is the oaths of office. Article 2, Section 1, last clause. The President promises to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Article 6, last clause. All other federal and state officers and judges promise to support the Constitution of the United States. 5. Next slide. When the civil authorities violate the higher law, we must rebuke them. In the Bible, the prophets rebuke the kings when they forsake God's law. Samuel rebuked King Saul. Nathan rebuked King David. A man of God rebuked King Jehoram. Elijah rebuked King Ahab. Elijah rebuked King Ahaziah. Elisha rebuked Jehoram, king of Israel. The prophets warned of the pending destruction of Jerusalem because of the sins of King Manasseh. And the book of Micah is one long rebuke. The black-robed regiment of our revolution, 240 years ago, our pastors were leaders in bringing about our revolution. They understood that the British King and Parliament were imposing tyranny on us in violation of God's law. In the Declaration of Independence, we itemized our grievances against the British and recited how we had petitioned for redress and warned them that if they didn't stop the usurpations, we would separate from them. Today, we don't have enough clergy with the knowledge and the spine to rebuke the federal government. They don't know the Bible. They don't know our founding principles and documents. Too many of our clergy just want to withdraw from the world, avoid controversy, and preserve their damned 501c3 tax exemption. The Catholic priests are speaking out about being forced to provide contraception and abortion pills as violations of their religious doctrines. But they should be denouncing the HHS rules as unconstitutional exercises of undelegated powers. Their goal should not be to carve out for themselves an exemption from rules they don't agree with, but to enforce the Constitution for everyone. Rebuke, biblical rebuke, does not consist in saying, well, I don't agree, or this violates my principles. A proper rebuke points to the higher law being violated and demands compliance with the higher law, not with one's personal views. Because the priests have focused on their religious beliefs instead of on biblical constitutional principles, the discussion in the media has been about the percentage of Catholics who use birth control, the implication being that since most Catholics use it, the priests are out of touch. But if the priest would just say, Obamacare is unconstitutional as outside the scope of the powers delegated to Congress, the medical care of the people not being one of the enumerated powers. If they would just say that the HHS rules are unconstitutional as outside the scope of the powers granted to the executive branch, and as in violation of, next slide, Article 1, Section 1, which provides that only Congress, elected representatives, as opposed to unelected bureaucrats, may make laws. All legislative powers are invested in Congress, not executive agencies. Then they would make a proper rebuke. And the discussion would be where it needs to be, on the enumerated powers of Congress and on the unconstitutionality of rulemaking by the executive agencies. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are theological documents. They come right out of the Bible, and it is the job of the clergy to know this and to defend God's Word. If the clergy won't do it, we the people must rebuke the civil authorities for their violations of the Constitution. How do you do this? 1, learn our founding principles and the Constitution. Read the Declaration and the Constitution. Read them every day until it becomes a part of you. I have papers on my website on just about every constitutional topic. I have a question and answer page where you can ask questions. When you post on the internet, write letters to the editor, talk to people, send email, stick to principles, cite the provision of our Constitution the civil authorities violated, or show that what they have done is not an enumerated power, and avoid personal opinions. Remember, the purposes of a biblical rebuke are to warn and teach, to warn the civil authorities of their violation of the higher law, and to educate the civil authorities and the people about the higher law. Next slide. 6. The people's obligation to obey the civil authorities is conditional upon the civil authorities obeying the higher law. The Bible shows that the people will suffer if they go along with the unlawful acts of the kings. God sent a 3-year famine because Saul put the Gibeonites to death. God sent a famine because Ahab and his house forsook the commandments of the Lord. God struck a heavy blow at Joram's people because of Joram's wickedness. God visited 4 dooms upon Jerusalem and the southern kingdom because of the sins of Manasseh. The parallel in our Constitution is this. Next slide. When Congress makes a law which is outside the scope of its enumerated powers, it is no law at all, but is void. Alexander Hamilton says this over and over and over in the Federalist Papers. Here are just 2 examples. Federalist Paper number 33. Acts of the federal government which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers will not become the supreme law of the land. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Federalist number 78. No legislative act contrary to the Constitution can be valid. Hamilton also tells us that Congress can't usurp powers unless the people go along with it. Next slide. In Federalist number 16, next to the last paragraph, Hamilton points out that judges may be embarked in a conspiracy with the legislature, and so the people who are the natural guardians of the Constitution must be enlightened enough to distinguish between a legal exercise and an illegal usurpation of authority. So, Hamilton applies the biblical model of what we are supposed to do when the federal government acts outside of the Constitution. We are to recognize that their acts are void, and we are to take whatever prudent measures are necessary to enforce the Constitution. So Hamilton is telling you to learn the Constitution, demand that the federal and state authorities obey it, and don't go along with them when they violate it. So, what can we do? After we learn our founding principles and documents, we can rebuke the civil authorities who violate the Constitution. Specify the violation. Usually the violation is that they did something which is not an enumerated power. Elect better representatives to all offices. Elect state and county officials who will nullify unconstitutional acts of Congress, the executive branch, and judicial opinions. On my website, I have model nullification resolutions for state legislatures, which can be adopted to fit any unconstitutional act of any branch of the federal government. We can use jury nullification in federal criminal trials. And we can elect to our state legislatures people who will employ secession if the need arises. Now, let us look at the 6 principles of biblical government Thomas Jefferson set forth in the Declaration. The Declaration of Independence is the fundamental act of our founding. Why is it so important? And why did Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan refuse to acknowledge its existence when Senator Tom Coburn questioned her at a confirmation hearing? You have to study the Bible to know the 6 principles I just listed. But in the second paragraph of the Declaration, Jefferson actually lists 6 more principles for all to see. The progressives hate, despise, and loathe these 6 principles. Next slide. Our Declaration of Independence says in the second paragraph, read it aloud with me, because this is one of the most important paragraphs ever written. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. The 6 principles, next slide, the 6 principles of biblical civil government listed here are: 1, equality before the law. 2, our rights come from God and are unalienable. 3, the purpose of civil government is to secure our God-given rights. 4, civil government is legitimate only when it stays within the powers we delegated to it. 4, civil government gets its powers from the people. And last, when a civil government becomes destructive of the purposes for which we formed it, we can get rid of it. 1, equality before the law. The Bible demands that judges favor neither the rich nor the poor, but to judge justly. It makes provision for aliens who accept and obey God to become adopted into the flock as equals. There is no rigid class structure. From our early days, we depicted justice as a woman wearing a blindfold holding scales. We extended citizenship to people who promised to assimilate. Our Constitution forbids titles of nobility. Sadly, for a long time, we did not extend equality before the law to black people, and we paid dearly for it, as a people always do when they violate God's law. But today we have abandoned the concept of equality before the law. We elected a president who said that he would appoint judges who would be empathetic to the poor and disadvantaged. We have classes of specially protected persons, homosexuals primarily. We allowed a ruling class to be formed. We stand when they walk into a room. We serve and ma'am them. They live under different laws than those they impose on us. Unlike the decadent aristocrats of old Europe, they live luxurious lives at our expense. 2, the source of our rights. Because the Declaration identifies the Creator as grantor of rights, we look to the Bible to see what those rights are. These rights include, but are not limited to, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, to work and enjoy the fruits of our own labors, to earn, inherit, and keep private property, to demand that the civil authorities obey the law, and to hold them accountable when they don't. As long as we don't take other people's God-given rights away from them by murder, stealing, false witness, etc., we have the right to be left alone. Rights come from God. They predate and pre-exist the Constitution. You don't get your rights from the Constitution, a document written by man. We established the Constitution to secure the rights God gave us, not to list the rights we were giving ourselves.
Thank you.
That's important.
Yes, it is.
And I'll tell you why. Article 3, Section 2, Clause 1 of the Constitution sets forth the judicial power of the federal courts. It says the judicial power of the United States shall extend to all matters, ... arising under this Constitution. The amendments to the Constitution arise under the Constitution. That is the clause which gives the U.S. Supreme Court jurisdiction over the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. That is how the Supreme Court took power to adjudicate religion, speech, and the right to bear arms. Amendments to the Constitution are very dangerous. So, the federal government is supposed to secure our God-given rights. The right to life, they do that. The federal government does that by establishing and maintaining a military defense. Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 10 through 16. The federal government is to secure our property rights by establishing honest money, honest weights and measurements, intellectual property rights, patents and copyrights, bankruptcy laws, and courts for the resolution of certain kinds of disputes. That's set forth in Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 4 through 9. And the right to be left alone by granting only a few and enumerated powers to the federal government. The state governments are supposed to secure our God-given right to life by prosecuting murderers, outlawing abortion, euthanasia, drunk driving, by quarantining people with dangerous contagious diseases, and the like. The right to the sanctity of our own persons by prosecuting rapists, muggers, kidnappers, child molesters. Our property rights by prosecuting robbers and cheats, punishing negligence, fraud, and breach of contract. Provide courts for dispute resolution. Do you see? Civil governments are supposed to secure the rights God gave us, primarily by protecting us from those who seek to take the God-given rights away from us. The civil governments must also provide fair trial. Next slide. Let's look at the God-given right to a fair trial. And of course, as a former trial lawyer, this one just, wow, that is so cool when I first saw this. Judges are required to be fair, impartial, and without favoritism. Yeah, well, that's what the Bible says. Witnesses must tell the truth. Bearing false witness is condemned. The evidence of 2 or more witnesses is required to prove a case. Public trials are required. And in the Apocrypha, the story of Daniel and Susanna illustrates the sequestration of witnesses, where the witnesses testify outside of the presence of each other. And we do that today. That is a charming story. It's only about 3 pages. Susanna is a very virtuous woman who was accused by 3 wicked men of adultery. And Daniel is acting as her counsel, and he demands that the witnesses testify outside of the presence of each other. And when he questions them, they all give different answers to different questions, so it's obvious that they're all lying. So, the right to a fair trial comes right out of the Bible, and civil governments are required to extend this right to the people. Compare Islam. I have heard that judges in morals cases, primarily adultery, are allowed to make their own subjective determinations that a woman is guilty, even in the absence of any evidence. And then the woman is stoned to death. No evidence. Now, listen. God-given rights may be held and enjoyed at no expense or loss to any other person. God-given rights don't put us in conflict with each other. When we work and produce something or provide a service, we are creating wealth. When we keep the wealth we create, we aren't taking anything away from anybody else. It is the phony rights fabricated by the federal and state governments. The right to live at other people's expense, the right to have other people forced to pay for our mistakes and failings, which has us at each other's throats, has destroyed our economy and crushed us and our descendants under a mountain of debt.
Amen.
Only when we exercise God-given rights alone can we live in peace with others and maintain a sound and prosperous economy. The fourth principle in the Declaration of Independence is that civil government gets its power from the people. We were founded on this principle, but we forgot it. We have reverted to the European model, the system our founders fled. In Europe and all other parts of the world, power has always been seen to originate with the government. The government has always been seen as the master, and the people mere subjects who must obey. The Roman emperors, King John I of England, Hitler, Stalin, Obama, all see themselves as the source of power. Here's your homework assignment. There is an excellent movie, Robin Hood, the one with Kate Blanchett and
Russell Crowe.
yes, Russell Crowe. The depiction of King John is magnificent. He sees himself as the source, the font of all power. Compare King John in that movie with the preamble to our Constitution. We, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution. So we, the people, are the source of all political power, and thus our Constitution is the formal expression of our consent for the federal government to exist. It is the formal statement of the powers which we agreed to delegate to each branch of the federal government and what we would permit them to do. We are the creator of the federal government. Next slide. Look at Alexander Hamilton's words. If the federal government should overpass the just bounds of the authority and make a tyrannical use of its powers, the people whose creature it is, Hamilton is calling the federal government our creature. That's what it is. And the Constitution contains the instructions our creature must follow. The fifth principle in the Declaration is that the federal government operates with our consent only when it obeys the Constitution. When it exercises powers which have not been delegated to it, it becomes illegitimate. When you understand how limited and precisely defined are the powers which we, the people, delegated to the three branches of the federal government, you are stunned at the extent of the usurpations by each branch. The federal government has been illegitimate for a long time. The sixth principle in the Declaration is that when civil government becomes destructive of the purposes for which we created it, we may alter or abolish it. Our American Revolution was about throwing off an English king and parliament which did not respect our God-given rights. But we today must understand that another bloody revolution would be futile. Our enemy is not Obama and its henchmen, secret conspirators, or the progressives and the Democrats. We the people are the problem. We abandoned the faith of our fathers. We forgot that our founding documents are based on God's model for civil government. Our clergy were silent when the federal government imposed the unbiblical and unconstitutional social insurance programs. The Bible says adult children are to take care of their aged parents, not the general public, and that has put us on the road to financial disaster. Our clergy censored their own speech in exchange for a federal tax exemption, yet there was a time when American pastors gave election day sermons. A civilization rises or falls depending upon whether the clergy are doing their job, and they haven't done their job for a very long time. They are supposed to be the watchmen on the wall, not people who withdraw from the world, surrender it to evil, and wait to be rescued from the disaster which results from their failure to do their job. We stopped reading the Declaration and Constitution when the 18th Amendment prohibition was ratified in 1919. Everyone knew that the amendment was needed to authorize Congress to make laws outlawing alcoholic beverages. Today, it doesn't occur to us to read the Constitution to see whether it delegates a power to Congress to make a law. All of us should be able to look at Article 1, Section 8, and see that Congress has no authority to enact Bush's prescription drug plan, Obamacare, and 99.9% of everything else they do. The big government people have been walking all over us for 100 years because we didn't stop them. And we kept re-electing the people who were walking all over us. We lost the understanding that some things are true, other things are false. Our Constitution has an objective meaning which is easily proved, usually by citations to the Federalist Papers. It is never properly a matter of opinion what our Constitution means. We are drowning in a sea of misinformation about the Constitution put out by judges, lawyers, law professors, the drive-by media, Fox News, talk show hosts, pundits, and all the know-it-alls out there with their ridiculous theories. Too many people on the internet read something which is not true but uncritically accept it and go around spreading it. Or they read something that is true but don't understand it and go around spreading their misunderstandings. They pretend to be an authority in their own right. The misinformation which has taken up residence in the minds of our people is the greatest impediment we have to restoring our constitutional republic. We exchanged our God-given rights for a phony set of man-made rights, all based on the lie that we have the right to live at other people's expense, and that we have the right to be protected from the risks and challenges of life. When we were founded, our motto was, "In God we trust." Now it is, "Take it from somebody else and give it to me." Since the early 1960s, there has been a concerted effort to eradicate the Bible from our land. Our Constitution doesn't work when its biblical foundation is ripped out. These 12 biblical principles I listed became our political foundation, but that political foundation has been ripped out of our seminaries, our law schools, the political science departments in our universities, and out of the minds of the people. So, the next revolution must take place in our own hearts and minds. We must reclaim the Judeo-Christian morality and teachings on civil government. We need our pastors to rediscover these principles and teach them. Next slide. The Scottish Puritan Reverend Samuel Rutherford, in his masterwork, Lex Rex, The Law Before the King, showing that the king is subject to a higher law, was published in 1644. It's online. You can learn these principles and disseminate them, but we don't have much time. Next, how should we read the Constitution? Does the Constitution have a fixed meaning that we can find out? Or may we subjectively interpret the Constitution however we want? The traditional view, the right view, is that texts have a specific meaning and it is your job to learn that meaning. So when you read, you must search for the original intent and not insert your own views into the text. The meaning of much of the Constitution is self-evident. However, we have been bombarded for so long with so much misinformation that we need to clean our minds of all the rubbish and start afresh. There is an authoritative commentary on the genuine meaning, the original intent of the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. I smile whenever I think of them. These are 85 essays written during 1787-88 by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, in order to explain the proposed Constitution to the people and to induce the people to ratify it. For this reason, the Federalist Papers are the authoritative commentary on the genuine meaning of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, and James Madison, father of the Constitution, agreed that the Federalist Papers are authoritative on the genuine meaning of the Constitution. Next slide. At a meeting of the leaders of the University of Virginia attended by Jefferson and Madison, they voted to make the Federalist Papers one of the texts for the law school. This is from the minutes of that meeting. Note that they refer to the Federalist Papers as an authority to which appeal is habitually made by all and rarely declined or denied by any, as evidence of the general opinion of those who framed and of those who accepted the Constitution on questions as to its genuine meaning. These essays are written in the late 18th century style. When I started studying them some 45 years ago, I outlined them on legal pads. But Mary E. Webster has translated them into modern English. You can find her on Amazon or Google her name to get her website. How to use the Federalist Papers. I have a paper copy with a table of contents which has a brief synopsis of each paper. The papers are grouped in logical fashion. You can study the table of contents with the synopsis and get an idea of what is in there and how the papers are organized. My edition also contains the text of the Constitution collated with the Federalist Papers. This is very helpful. If you look at the Interstate Commerce Clause at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, it links you to the paper where Madison discusses this clause. There, Madison says that the purpose of that clause is to stop the states from imposing tolls and tariffs on articles of merchandise as they are transported through the states for purposes of buying and selling. In other words, if you grow cotton in Georgia and you're sending your cotton up to the mills in Massachusetts, all of the states in between wouldn't be allowed to tax your cotton. The collation of this online edition, you can copy the Federalist Papers from the online edition, paste them onto MS Word, enlarge the print, and color code them as you study them. This morning on Fox, I overheard someone quoting, this is the second time in my life I've heard the Federalist Papers mentioned on television. I heard someone say that Madison said that laws should not be so voluminous that they can't be read, so incoherent that they can't be understood. And I said, I'm going to find that in the Federalist Papers. So I just pulled up my online edition. I typed in voluminous in the search box. 2 hits came up. I clicked on the first hit. I used the search function on my page. I typed in voluminous. Zing, there it was. There was a quote right there, just a few pages from the bottom of Federalist Paper number 62. I use the online search feature very, very often. The essays in the Federalist Papers are masterpieces and are the most important commentary on political theory ever written outside of the Bible. I also use Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1828, for word meanings. Words change meaning throughout time. 200 years ago, commerce meant the buying and selling of goods. But in 1942, the U.S. Supreme Court decided the notorious Wickard v. Filburn case. They redefined commerce from buying and selling goods to mean whatever they want it to mean, so they can justify the regulation of whatever they want Congress to regulate, even when it has nothing to do with the buying and selling of goods. So, we must learn what the words meant when the Constitution was written, and we must use those definitions, not the perverted ones made up by the Supreme Court. I use my Webster's 1828 all the time. The modern view is that a text means whatever the reader thinks it means. The concept of a text having a fixed and objective meaning has been thrown out. Someone told me of an incident which occurred in his high school English class during 1960. The class read a short story, and then the teacher asked each student to say what the story meant to him. Whatever a student said was praised by the teacher. But when it was my friend's turn, he said, "It doesn't matter what it means to me. What matters is what the author meant." The teacher was not pleased with this out-of-place comment. Our schools long ago stopped teaching students how to look for the objective meaning of a text. Instead, they teach that texts have no inherent meaning. Each person is to come up with his own understanding, and one person's understanding is as good as another person's understanding. But of course, when that happens, the only understanding which counts is the understanding of the person holding the power. But if you object to that, too bad, because there is no objective standard by which to measure. Is it any wonder that judges on the Supreme Court feel free to understand the Constitution any way they please? They were conditioned in school to believe this way. They did not resist the conditioning. That's what the Supreme Court has been doing for 100 years. They say the Constitution is an evolving document, and they are in charge of deciding how it evolves. You have all heard of Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. During the late 1800s, the progressives took this theory of evolution and applied it to law and the Constitution. So people stopped seeing law and the Constitution as a set of fixed principles, and the Constitution as embodying a set of fixed principles based on God's law and explained by the Federalist Papers, and adopted a new view where the Constitution is seen as an evolving document. And that's how we got to where we are today, applying evolution to law and the Constitution. What is the federal form of government? This is very important. Most people think we're a nation. That is a pernicious lie. We created a federal republic. With the Constitution, we, the people, created a federation. The federation we created is an alliance of independent and sovereign states associated in a confederation with a general or federal government to which is delegated authority over the states in a few specifically defined areas only. These areas are listed primarily at Article 1, Section 8 of our federal Constitution. The list at Article 1, Section 8 is very short. You have a handout sheet which says at the very top line, the Declaration of Independence says God endowed us with rights. That sheet illustrates two things. It illustrates several of the principles in the Declaration of Independence. It also illustrates the federal form of the government we created. Note that I put the federal governments and the states side by side. I didn't put the federal government on top because it doesn't belong on top. We didn't create a pyramid with the federal government on top for everything. We created a federation. The federal government is on the left side, the states are on the right. The federal government has lawful authority only over the enumerated objects of federal power listed on the left side of the chart. Its external powers deal with international trade and diplomacy, war and treaty making. Its internal powers for the country at large are listed. That's basically all the federal government has authority to do for the country at large. Now look on the right side at the quote from Federalist number 45 by James Madison. That paragraph is one of the most important in all of the Federalist Papers. This is also the paragraph which Dr. Walter E. Williams quotes whenever he substitutes for Rush Limbaugh. Our Constitution delegates only a few defined and enumerated powers to the federal government. Everything else is reserved to the states and the people. And that's what James Madison, the father of our Constitution, is saying. There is no higher authority than that. This chart provides the framework for how our federal government is supposed to work. Use it as your outline for future study. The chart is like a skeleton which needs to be fleshed out, but you can only flesh it out by using the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers. Don't flesh it out by inserting your own thoughts. We must conform our thoughts to the Constitution, and I am guided always by the Federalist Papers. I'll illustrate how to flesh out the chart. See where it says on the left side, under External, that the federal government has authority to make treaties, but only on objects authorized by the Constitution. Consider the proposed UN gun control treaty. If you read through the Constitution, you'll find that Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 says that ratification of treaties requires the approval of 2/3 of the senators present. So if all 100 senators are present, 34 senators can kill a treaty. But the Federalist Papers show us more about treaty-making power of the United States. The federal government may not lawfully do by treaty something which the Constitution does not already permit it to do. The Constitution does not authorize the federal government to restrict our guns. Therefore, they may not lawfully restrict our guns by treaty. They can't lawfully circumvent the Constitution by making treaties. I have 2 papers on my website explaining the treaty-making power of the federal government. I prove my points by citations to the Federalist Papers, along with some quotes from our beloved Thomas Jefferson. So, the federal government can lawfully make treaties only on objects which are among the enumerated powers. I'll illustrate. The Constitution authorizes the federal government to issue patents and copyrights. Since patents and copyrights are an enumerated object of federal power, they may lawfully make a treaty concerning international patent and copyright protection. But the federal government may not lawfully make a treaty restricting our guns, or imposing the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child, or a climate change treaty, because these are not objects of the enumerated powers delegated to our federal government. Next point, enumerated powers. So, our Constitution lists, itemizes everything we the people authorized each branch of the federal government to do. If a power isn't listed, they have no lawful authority to do it. If they do it anyway, next slide, they are usurping powers not delegated to them. Over and over and over in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Madison remind us that the federal government has enumerated powers only. I have 4 quotes here, but I had to select from a long list. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated objects. In the second quote, Hamilton, you can usually recognize Hamilton quotes. He loves emphasis. He always uses caps. Acts of Congress become part of the Supreme Court only if they are enumerated objects of federal power. Certain enumerated objects only. Do you see? To find out whether the federal government has power to impose Obamacare, Medicaid, manage student loans, regulate your light bulbs, control the education of your children, restrict your guns, limit what you grow on your land, control your access to medical care, just look it up in Article 1, Section 8. If it isn't listed, Congress has no authority to do it. It really is that simple. On my website, I have 3 papers on the enumerated powers of each of the 3 branches of the federal government. I list every single constitutional power they have. You may find the paper on the President's enumerated powers especially interesting. In addition to listing all his powers, I explain executive orders and show why all rulemaking by executive agencies is completely unlawful. Yeah. I prepared another sheet for you which says at the very top 3 clauses the federal government abuses to evade the enumerated powers limitation. You might ask, how does the federal government get away with making all these laws which are not listed among their enumerated powers? These 3 clauses are how they did it. The Taxing and General Welfare Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. They just claim that whatever they want to do fits within one or more of these clauses. They have attempted to justify Obamacare on the ground that it is authorized by the General Welfare Clause, the Taxing Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. I have papers rebutting these arguments on my website. On that handout sheet, I set forth the lying claims the progressives make about each of these 3 clauses, and I provide you with the truthful answers with citations to the Federalist Papers to prove that what I'm telling you is the truth. Learn these 3 clauses. Learn the arguments. Look them up in the Federalist Papers. Outline the paragraphs cited. And when Lee Sweell gets on Fox News and lies about how one of these clauses justifies some statist scheme, she lies, you will know the answer. And you can have a lot of fun with clueless politicians at town hall meetings. I met with the former congressman from my congressional district, a Democrat, when he was still in office. And I objected to Obamacare. I said, it's unconstitutional. He said, the General Welfare Clause permits it. And I said, oh, Congressman, don't you know what James Madison said in Federalist Paper number 41 in the last 4 paragraphs? And then I told him what was on the sheet. He turned pale. He stuttered and he stammered. I said, write that down, and when you go home today, look it up and read it. And then I said, Congressman, I challenge you to a public debate on the Constitution. Will you accept? And he said, no. He wouldn't meet with us as a group. He would only meet on us in little groups of 2, where he could intimidate us with his high stature. When I went down the stairs and I met with all the the other people waiting to have their turn before the great one, I stood and I said, I have an announcement. I have challenged Congressman Bart Gordon to a public debate on the Constitution. And he declined. They cannot defend their positions intellectually. When you challenge them, they fold, they collapse. So learn those arguments. It's not difficult. When you talk to congressmen at town hall meetings or U.S. senators, it's all right to read. There is a magnificent YouTube of a woman in Congressman Pete Stark's district in California. Did you see that? Where she is saying that Obamacare is slavery and violates the 13th Amendment. She did a magnificent job. She wasn't a lawyer. She was reading. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to know it by heart. You can read. She did a great job. All of you can do it. When we challenge them, when we confront them, they fold. They can't defend their positions. They just stutter and stammer or get mad. And it's really a lot of fun to see a congressman turn pale. Now I'll talk about the division of powers between the legislative and executive branches. Remember, mankind is too corrupt for one person to hold legislative, executive, and judicial power. So our Constitution divides these powers among 3 branches. Now look at the chart with the little boxes on it, which says at the very top, we, the creators of the federal government, delegated these. This chart lists most of the enumerated powers of Congress, note how short the list is, lists most of the enumerated powers of the President, note how short the list is. This chart is important because it shows how few and limited are the enumerated powers delegated to Congress and the President, and it shows how power over the same objects is divided between the legislative and executive branches. Congress makes the laws, the President implements them if they are constitutional. Congress declares war, funds the military, makes the rules for the military. The President is merely the top general after Congress has declared war. The President negotiates the treaties, the Senate approves or rejects them. The President makes nominations for office, the Senate approves or rejects them, and so on down the list. Power over the same objects is divided. Our framers divided up the powers so that each branch could check the other branch. These checks are built into the Constitution, and most of them are shown on the chart. But the biggest and most important check of all is the oath of office. The oaths are set forth in the Constitution. The oath is to obey the Constitution. It is not to go along with the other branches. The President does not promise to obey Congress or the Supreme Court. His promise is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Every other federal official and judge is supposed to obey the Constitution. It is supposed to support the Constitution. So, each branch of the federal government is supposed to obey the Constitution, not go along with the other branches. So, if Congress makes an unconstitutional law, the President would violate his oath of office if he goes along with it, even if Congress enacts the law over the President's veto. If the Supreme Court issues an unconstitutional opinion, Congress and the President would violate their oaths of office if they go along with it. Remember, the Constitution is superior to Congress, the executive branch, and the federal judges. Note also that Article 6 requires state and local officials and judges also to take the oath to support the Constitution. That oath requires them to refuse to implement acts of Congress, executive orders of the President, and Supreme Court decisions which violate the Constitution. When the federal government acts outside the powers delegated by the Constitution, their acts are unlawful, mere usurpations to be treated as such. This is the basis for nullification of unconstitutional acts of the federal government. And again, I've got model nullification resolutions on my website. Nullification of unconstitutional acts of the federal government are a moral obligation imposed by the oath of office. And finally, the amendment craze. Every proposed amendment I have seen is a terrible idea. I have 2 papers on my website showing why the balanced budget amendment is the worst idea since sin. The proposed 28th Amendment is a terrible idea. I have a paper on that. The national popular vote for president is a monstrous idea. I have a paper on that. The proposed parental rights amendment is an even worse idea than sin. I haven't written on that, but the result of that amendment would be to grant to the federal government jurisdiction over the upbringing of children. The proponents of this amendment are lying, but they have duped a number of naive fools into supporting this amendment. You cannot go by the nice-sounding names. They come up with those names to deceive you. Worst of all are the constant calls from progressive groups calling for a con-con. The Goldwater Institute is a major offender. Do not be deceived by these phony conservatives. Except for some amendments which we foolishly ratified and which have caused lots of problems, primarily the 16th and the 17th, which we need to repeal, our Constitution is not the problem. The problem is that everyone ignores the Constitution. So my purpose is to show the genuine meaning of our Constitution so that you can join the battle to restore it as the law of this land. We must build an army of people who will learn the true meaning of the Constitution and spread that knowledge throughout the land. Read it. Imagine being at the Federal Convention when it was drafted. George Washington presided. James Madison was there. Alexander Hamilton was there. Benjamin Franklin was there. Imagine them discussing it and going over it and hammering out the glorious masterpiece they gave us, except for a few flaws, primarily the slavery issue. It was an inspired work. Again, at my website, I have a question and answer page. I answer all the questions, usually within 24 hours, sometimes immediately. Thank you for your attention. If you have questions about the Constitution, I'll answer them.